The sommelier held the glass to the light, swirled it gently, and tasted. His eyes closed. When they opened, he looked at Elena Vasquez like she performed magic. Where did you say this came from? My vineyard. 11 acres in Sonoma County. This shouldn't exist, he said quietly. The complexity, the structure. This is what people spend decades trying to achieve. How long have you been making wine? 8 months. He set down the glass carefully, like it might shatter. I'll take every bottle you can produce. Name your price. 9 months earlier, the auction in Sonoma County lasted 19 minutes. Property 058-142-091, 11 acres, January 23, 2023, 2:14 p.m. Elena Vasquez, 26 years old, held a cashier's check for $47,000. Everything from her grandfather's estate after the funeral costs, after the medical bills, after the government took their share. The auctioneer's voice carried across the county courthouse steps. Abandoned vineyard, eastern hillside, old vines, no irrigation system, no equipment included. Do I hear 40,000? Around her, men in expensive boots whispered. The vineyard had a reputation. Planted in 1982, produced award-winning Zinfandel until 2009. Then the owner died, and the heirs let it rot. 14 years of neglect. The vines were overgrown, diseased, worthless. The land's only value was in clearing it and planting something modern. 40,000, Elena said. A man in a leather jacket glanced at her, then away. No counterbid. The gavel fell. She signed the deed in a room that smelled like old books and lemon cleaner. The clerk, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, pushed the papers across. You're Carlos Vasquez's granddaughter? Yes, ma'am. He tried to buy this property in 2007. The owner wouldn't sell. Your grandfather said these were some of the best vines in the valley. She paused. That was before they were abandoned. Elena nodded. She'd been 14 when Grandpa Carlos lost his job at the winery. 32 years as cellar master. Let go when the corporate buyout happened. He'd worked odd jobs after that, saved every dollar in mason jars hidden in the garage, and written everything he knew about wine in leather-bound notebooks he kept locked in a truck. He'd left her 2 things. The $47,000 and a key to that truck, with a note in his careful handwriting. Mija, this land holds the old vines I told you about. The ones planted by Antonio Guerrero, who learned from his father in Zacatecas. The spacing is wrong by modern standards. The rootstock is unfashionable, but the vines know secrets the new ones don't. Read my notebooks. Trust the old methods. Do not waste words on those who mock you. Let the wine speak. Inside the truck, for notebooks filled with her grandfather's notes, a hand-drawn map of the Sonoma hillsides dated 1985, and recipes. Not for wine exactly, but for reading land, understanding vines, working with what existed instead of forcing what you wanted. She drove to the property that afternoon in her grandfather's 1994 Ford Ranger, which needed new shocks and had 198,000 miles showing. The vineyard was a disaster. Vines sprawled wild and unpruned. Thick trunks twisted like arthritic hands. Weeds waist-high. The old equipment shed leaned hard to the left, roof partially collapsed. Deer fencing torn down. The whole place looked like a graveyard. But Elena walked the rows anyway. It took 3 hours. The vines were gnarly, chaotic, some trunks thick as fence posts. Most viticulturists would rip them out. Modern vineyards used high-density planting, precise irrigation, standardized spacing. These vines were scattered, irregular, planted to follow the hillside's natural contours. She found the survey stake her grandfather had marked on his map and counted rows from there. Vines 47 through 93, he'd written, were special, different rootstock, planted by Guerrero himself. That night, in the tent she pitched beside the shed, Elena opened the first notebook by battery lantern. Her grandfather's notes were meticulous. These vines were Old California. Field blend, mixed varieties planted together, Zinfandel, Petite Syrah, Carignan, even some mission grapes. Not fashionable, not single varietal, but balanced in ways modern vineyards couldn't replicate. He'd written, the old Italians and Mexicans understood, plant mixed, plant to the land, not to the grit. The vines compete and cooperate. The weak die, the strong share resources. In 20 years, you have something no nursery can sell you. Wisdom in the wood. Below that, Detailed instructions for pruning wild vines, rebuilding soil health, dry farming techniques that used no irrigation. And this, underlined twice, do not irrigate. These vines have roots 30 feet deep. They taste the hillside's bones. Water from hoses makes weak wine. The next morning, she started pruning. The work was brutal. Thick canes that fought back, thorns that tore her gloves, her back screaming by noon. She worked alone because hiring help cost money she didn't have. The neighbors came to watch. First was Thomas Brennan, owner of Brennan Family Wines, 23 acres of Cabernet and Chardonnay, modern trellising, awards on every bottle. He drove up in a clean Mercedes, stood outside his car. "You're the one who bought the dead vineyard?" "Yes, sir." He looked at the wild vines, the chaos, her tent. "What's your plan?" "Restore it. Make wine." His laugh was short and sharp. "You can't make wine from those. They're diseased, overgrown, probably phylloxera infested. You need to rip them out, fumigate, replant with certified rootstock." Elena kept pruning. "These vines are 40 years old. I'm not ripping them out." "Then you're wasting your time." He got back in his Mercedes. "Good luck. You'll need it." The second visitor was Janet Poole, who ran the tasting room at Ridge Valley Vineyards, a mid-sized operation that produced 15,000 cases annually. She was younger, maybe 35, and her expression was more puzzled than dismissive. "I heard someone bought the Guerrero vineyard. You're really trying to save it?" "Yes. Those vines haven't been managed in 14 years. The disease pressure alone. I'm pruning out the diseased wood. The healthy canes are strong." Janet walked into the rows, touched a trunk, examined the bark. "Even if you get them healthy, field blends are hard to market. Consumers want single varietals. They want to know what they're drinking. My grandfather's notes say blends have more complexity. Maybe in 1950. Not now." She softened slightly. "Look, I respect what you're trying to do. But the market has moved on. Nobody's paying premium prices for old vine field blends from an unknown producer." After she left, Elena kept working. The sun was merciless. Her shoulders burned. She didn't stop. 3 weeks later, the vines were pruned. She'd removed tons of deadwood, leaving only the strongest canes. The vineyard still looked rough, but the structure was emerging. Those old trunks, those deep roots. And then she found the problem. Powdery mildew, thick on the leaves of 37 vines in the southeast section. She called the county viticulture advisor. He came out the next day, walked the affected rows, and shook his head. "You need to spray? Sulfur at minimum, probably a synthetic fungicide. Otherwise, this'll spread and kill your whole crop." Elena opened her grandfather's notebook to page 61. He'd drawn diagrams of companion planting, of using wild mustard and native grasses to change the microclimate, of introducing specific predatory insects. "What if I don't spray?" she asked. "Then you'll lose the vintage. Maybe the vineyard." "My grandfather's notes say chemical sprays weaken the vine's natural immunity." The advisor's face hardened. "Your grandfather worked in an era before we understood fungal pathogens. Science has advanced. If you don't spray, you're gambling everything on superstition." He left his contact information and drove away. Elena stood in the infected rows and made her choice. She didn't spray. The mildew got worse before it got better. By March, 49 vines showed infection. Elena worked 18-hour days, removing affected leaves by hand, planting native yarrow and wild fennel between rows to change air circulation, introducing lacewings and ladybugs she ordered from a biological supply house using a credit card she couldn't afford to max out. Her bank account hit $67. She ate rice and beans, showered at the county rec center, charged her phone at the library. The neighbors watched like she was a performance art piece about failure. Thomas Brennan drove past twice a week, slowing down to observe. Once, he stopped. "Still not spraying?" "No, sir. I can see the mildew from the road. It's spreading." Elena said nothing. Her grandfather's words, "Do not waste words on those who mock you." Brennan shook his head and left. But on March 31st, something shifted. The new companion plants had matured enough to change the microclimate, better airflow, different humidity patterns. The lacewings were reproducing, eating the aphids that stressed the vines. And the vines themselves, forced to fight the infection without chemical help, seemed to be developing resistance. The mildew stopped spreading. Then, slowly, it began to recede. By April, new growth emerged, healthy, vigorous, disease-free. Elena walked the rows at dawn on April 15th and felt something she hadn't felt in months: hope. Bud break came late that year, but when it came, it was explosive. The old vines pushed out shoots with shocking vigor, leaves dark green and thick. By May, tiny flower clusters appeared. She was going to get a crop, but fruit was only the beginning. Making wine required equipment she didn't have and knowledge she was still learning from notebooks. She called every winery in a 30-mile radius, asking if they'd do custom crush, let her use their equipment for a fee. 17 said no outright. 3 said yes, but the prices were impossible: $15,000 minimum, plus per ton fees. The 18th call was to Ridge Valley Vineyards. Janet Pohl answered. "It's Elena Vasquez, from the Guerrero property." A pause. "I heard your vines survived the mildew without spraying. People are talking about it. I need custom crush services. I can't afford the rates I've been quoted." Another pause, longer. "How much fruit are you expecting?" "Maybe 3 tons. The vines are still recovering." "That's tiny. Most facilities won't even bother." Janet's voice changed, became quieter. "My grandfather started this winery with 2 tons of fruit in a borrowed crusher. He's gone now, but look, I'll do it for $3,000 flat. You help with the work, we'll figure it out." Elena's throat tightened. "Why?" "Because someone helped my grandfather once. And because I'm curious what those old vines will produce." Summer was a crucible. Elena hand-thinned clusters, dropping fruit to concentrate the flavors, a practice her grandfather's notes emphasized, but modern vineyards often skipped because it reduced yield. She removed leaves to increase sun exposure, but not too many. She walked every row twice a day, watching for disease, for pests, for stress. The vines were dry-formed, no irrigation, just like her grandfather prescribed. During the July heat wave, 17 days above 95 degrees, she watched her fruit shrivel slightly, while neighboring irrigated vineyards stayed plump. Thomas Brennan stopped again. "You're losing fruit to dehydration. You need to water." "The vines are fine. Your clusters are half the size of mine." "Yes, sir." He drove away shaking his head. But Elena's grandfather had written, "Small fruit, thick skins, concentrated flavors. 1 ton of dry-farmed grapes makes wine worth 5 tons of irrigated ones. Trust the vines. They know how to survive." By August, her clusters were small but dense, the grapes dark purple, almost black. She tasted one on August 23rd. The sugar and acid balance was perfect, the tannins firm but not harsh, and the flavor was intense. Blackberry, earth, something almost mineral. She tested the bricks, sugar content, every 3 days. Modern vineyards often harvested at high bricks for bigger alcohol and fruit-forward flavors. Her grandfather's notes said to pick earlier, at lower sugar, for balance and longevity. On September 8th, at 23.2 bricks, she harvested. She picked by hand over 3 days, starting at dawn when the grapes were cool. No crew. Just her, 5 volunteers from the county AG program, and Janet Pohl, who showed up unasked with coffee and pastries. They filled half-ton bins carefully, sorting out underripe or damaged fruit. The total yield, 2.5 tons from 11 acres. Absurdly low by modern standards. At Ridge Valley's facility, Elena and Janet crushed the grapes together. The old destemmer rattled and groaned. The must, crushed grapes, skins, seeds, went into small fermentation tanks. Janet handed her a hydrometer. "You're the winemaker. You make the calls." Elena consulted her grandfather's notebook. He'd written about native yeast fermentation, using the wild yeasts on the grape skins instead of commercial strains. Riskier, slower, but more complex. "We're using native yeast," Elena said. Janet's eyes widened. "That's a gamble. If the fermentation sticks or develops off flavors, I know." For 3 weeks, Elena slept on a cot in Ridge Valley's cellar, monitoring temperatures, punching down the cap of skins twice daily, tasting, adjusting. The fermentation was slow and unpredictable, exactly what her grandfather's notes predicted. Thomas Brennan visited Janet's tasting room in late September and saw Elena through the cellar window, working. "She's still at it?" he asked Janet. "She's made some unusual choices," Janet said carefully. "But the fermentation is progressing." "What's it smell like?" Janet had sneaked a taste that morning. She chose her words carefully. "Different. Old style. Like wines my grandfather used to make before everything became formulaic. Brennan grunted and left. By October, the fermentation was complete. Elena pressed the wine gently, aged it in neutral oak barrels Janet found in the back of the warehouse. Old French oak that wouldn't overpower the fruit. And then she waited. Winter was quiet. Elena lived in the equipment shed. She'd repaired the roof, insulated the walls, made it barely habitable. She worked part-time at a Vineyard supply store, saved every dollar, and visited her barrels twice a week, tasting the wine as it evolved. In December, she bottled 300 cases, 3,600 bottles. She designed simple labels on her laptop, printed them at a copy shop, applied each one by hand. No distributor would touch an unknown brand. She had no tasting room, no marketing budget, no connections. She had wine, and she had belief. On January 15, 2024, she loaded 60 bottles into the Ford Ranger and drove to San Francisco, to restaurants and wine shops her grandfather had mentioned in his notebooks, places that valued story and craft over brand names. 17 stops, 17 rejections. Too unknown, too risky, too expensive at the $50 retail price she'd calculated she needed to break even. At the 18th stop, a small restaurant called Tranche, the sommelier was a man named Marcus Chun, maybe 40, with tired eyes. "I don't do cold calls," he said. "I understand. But my grandfather was Carlos Vasquez. He was cellar master at Artisan Ridge Winery. I know. I met him once years ago. He taught me how to taste for structure instead of fruit." Marcus's expression shifted. "You're his granddaughter." "Yes." "Let me try the wine." Marcus Chun poured carefully, using a crystal glass that caught the restaurant's low light. The wine was dark, almost opaque, purple-black with a ruby edge. He swirled it, nosed it, and his expression changed. He tasted. The silence stretched for 10 seconds. "What am I tasting?" he asked quietly. "Old Vine Zinfandel, Petite Syrah, Carignan, some Mission grape. Field blend, dry farmed, native yeast fermentation, minimal intervention. The tannins are resolved, but present. The fruit is restrained. There's earth, leather, something almost." He paused. "This tastes like wines I've only had from ancient bottles. Wines from before modern viticulture. How is this possible from a first vintage? The vines are 40 years old. They were neglected for 14 years, but the roots go deep. My grandfather's notes said old vines remember." Marcus set the glass down like it was fragile. "I'll take every bottle you can sell me. What's your price?" $50. "That's below what this is worth. I'll sell it at $75 and it'll move." He pulled out his phone. "I'm calling 3 other sommeliers right now. If your wine is consistent bottle to bottle, you're going to sell out." Elena felt the floor tilt slightly. "I have 300 cases. You'll need more." By February, Tranche had sold through its allocation. The other 3 restaurants Marcus contacted placed orders. Then a wine writer for the San Francisco Chronicle visited Tranche, tasted Elena's wine blind in a flight with Colt Zinfandels priced at $150, and ranked it second. The article published on February 28, "Unknown winemaker resurrects abandoned vineyard, produces stunning throwback Zinfandel." Elena's phone started ringing. Distributors, restaurants, wine shops, private collectors. Thomas Brennan, asking if they could talk. She met him at his winery on March 3rd. He poured his current release Cabernet, a beautiful wine, polished and modern. "Congratulations," he said. "I was wrong about your vines." "Thank you. I've been making wine for 22 years. I've won awards. But what you made, there's something there I can't achieve. That old vine complexity, that restraint." He paused. "Would you consult for me? I have a block of 30-year-old vines I've been irrigating and cropping heavily. I want to try your approach." Elena thought about her grandfather's words. Not about mockery, but about knowledge. "Yes, I'll help." By April, she'd sold every bottle at $50 wholesale, which translated to $75 to $85 retail. Wine writers were calling it a unicorn vintage. Collectors were offering triple on the secondary market. But Elena wasn't celebrating. She was in the vineyard, pruning, preparing for vintage 2. Janet Pohl visited on a Saturday morning, brought coffee. They walked the rows together. "You could raise your prices," Janet said. "People would pay it. My grandfather's notes say wine is for drinking, not speculation. $50 is fair. You're leaving money on the table." I'm building something that lasts. Janet smiled. He'd be proud of you. In May, the County Extension Service asked Elena to speak at their annual viticulture conference. The room was packed. 200 farmers, winemakers, vineyard managers. Many had dismissed her a year earlier. She stood at the podium with her grandfather's notebook, worn and dirt-stained. My grandfather Carlos Vasquez worked in wine for 40 years, she began. He wasn't famous. He didn't own a winery, but he understood vines in ways I'm still learning. He taught me that the land holds knowledge we've forgotten in our rush to optimize, mechanize, and standardize. She talked about dry farming, about old vines, about native yeast, about patience, about letting vines struggle because struggle builds character, about trusting methods that seemed outdated but carried wisdom. Thomas Brennan sat in the third row, taking notes. When she finished, the questions lasted an hour. Afterward, 17 people asked if she'd consult on their properties. She said yes to 5. Small growers, struggling, reminded her of her grandfather. By June, Vintage 2 was underway. The vines looked stronger this year, fuller canopy, better fruit set. Elena had hired 2 part-time workers, both young, both hungry to learn old methods. She still lived in the equipment shed, but she'd saved enough to buy a used tractor and build a small fermentation facility on the property. No more borrowing Janet's space. The second vintage harvest came in September, 3 tons this time. The grapes were exceptional, smaller than last year, but even more concentrated. This time, Elena fermented on her own property, in tanks she'd bought used from a winery going out of business. She still used native yeast, still followed her grandfather's notes, still made every decision based on feel and taste rather than formula. And in November, when she bottled Vintage 2, the pre-orders had already exceeded her production. 400 cases, all sold before the wine touched glass. She raised the price to $60. It sold out in a week. By December 2024, 2 years after the auction, Elena's 11 acres were nationally recognized. Wine Spectator scored her Vintage 2 at 94 points. Collectors waited on lists. Other winemakers visited to learn. And Douglas Trent, a wine industry investor, arrived in a black Range Rover. Miss Vasquez, I represent a consortium interested in acquiring premium vineyard properties. We'd like to buy your land. I'm authorized to offer $750,000. Elena was in the vineyard, pruning. The vines were gnarly and strong, their trunks thick with decades. Not for sale. That's 15 times what you paid. You could buy a larger property, expand production. These vines aren't replaceable. The answer is no. He left his card. She composted it. In January 2025, Elena hired her 4th employee, a young woman named Sarah, 23, who just graduated from the viticulture program at Fresno State with debt and dreams. I can't pay much, Elena warned. I don't care. I want to learn what you know. They pruned together in the winter cold, and Elena taught her to read vines the way her grandfather had taught her. By touch, by observation, by respect. And on January 23, 2025, exactly 2 years after the auction, Elena sat on the porch of her rebuilt equipment shed and opened her grandfather's notebook one last time. The last page, which she'd never read, held a final entry. Mija, if you're reading this, you succeeded. I knew you would. You have patience and stubbornness, both necessary for wine. But remember, success is not the wine in bottles or the money in banks. Success is keeping the old vines alive, passing the knowledge forward, proving that wisdom doesn't expire. You are not just making wine. You are remembering what matters. I love you. Make me proud. Elena closed the notebook carefully. Around her, 11 acres of old vines stood dark against the winter sky, their roots deep, their future secured. She'd made her grandfather proud, and she'd done it by trusting him, by ignoring mockery, by believing that some things, old vines, old knowledge, old love, were worth more than efficiency or profit. The wine had spoken. The land had testified. And Elena Vasquez, once dismissed, once doubted, had proven that the smallest vineyard could produce something irreplaceable. Not just wine, but legacy. She smiled, just slightly, and went back to work.